How do you lose that deep belly fat after menopause? Well, there's a lot of conflicting advice out there on social media, but what does the actual science say? Well, in this video, we'll find out. This is my second in a two-part series on visceral fat. In video 1, we learnt what it is and why it matters to midlife women. And in this video, we'll talk about how to reduce it. And if we've not met, hi, I'm Ruth, a retired NHS doctor turned health coach. And I make videos for women over 50 who want to overhaul their habits so they can age in great health. And if you're returning, thanks so much. Now, to briefly summarise video number 1 in a sentence or two, visceral fat is that deep fat inside the abdominal cavity underneath the abdominal wall muscles that wraps around our organs. It secretes pro-inflammatory substances, so is associated with chronic diseases like type 2 diabetes and heart disease. Now, in midlife women, the increase in total body fat, well, that's due to age and a reduction in activity levels. There is no additional effect from the menopause itself. But what the menopause does do is affect fat distribution. So we start to accumulate more of it in our midsection. And if we want to reduce it, then the solution in a nutshell is diet and exercise. So no surprises there then. But we can get a lot more specific and look at the nuance. So I'm going to split this video into 3 parts: what to eat, how to move, and what else you need to do. So starting with diet, and there's 2 factors at play here: diet quality and diet quantity. And in terms of quantity, there's many studies showing that eating in a calorie deficit, well, that will reduce visceral fat. And there's a couple of studies showing that it actually doesn't really matter what type of diet it is, as long as you're eating less than you're burning. But there are some things you can add to your diet that likely make a difference, and we'll come on to that in a minute. Firstly, type of diet. So in this trial from 2012, they looked at 4 different types of diet. Number 1, low fat, average protein, 65% carb. Number 2, low fat, high protein with 55% carbs. 3, high fat, average protein, that was 45% carb. And 4th, high fat, high protein with 35% carb. Now, all the diets included less than 8% saturated fat, and they all included low glycemic index carbs. And participants were men and women between the ages of 30 and 70. And at 2 years, all the groups showed a similar amount of weight loss, and the diets were equally good at reducing visceral fat. However, when they checked at the 6-month and the 2-year mark, participants weren't that good at sticking to the diets. In particular, the low-fat group ate too much fat and the low-carb group ate too much carbs. So the homogenization and increased similarity of the diets over time, well, that might explain the results. But what we can say is that a mild calorie deficit combined with lower saturated fat and low glycemic index carbs, well, that does seem to reduce visceral fat. Now, in this more up-to-date randomised controlled trial, 3 diets were compared. Firstly, a low-carb group, and they were told to keep their saturated fat less than 30%. The other 2 groups were higher in carbohydrate, and they kept the saturated fat less than 10%. Now, the first carbohydrate group only contained unprocessed carbohydrates like fruit, vegetables, and whole grains. The second group, they did have a degree of processing in the diet in that they ate things like bread and pasta. However, neither group contained the more harmful carbohydrates, the refined carbohydrates, like cakes and cookies and pastries. They all kept added sugar low. And this is important because we know that added sugar in the diet, particularly in the form of sugar-sweetened drinks, contributes to the development of visceral fat. And in this trial, participants did stick to their diet pretty well, but what happened in this one was that quite a few participants dropped out along the way, and this can introduce some bias. And all 3 groups lost visceral fat in the face of just a modest drop in calories, likely due to the improvement in diet quality. So the takeaway from these 2 studies is that you can lose visceral fat if the quality of your diet improves. So moving towards whole foods from processed foods. And this includes keto diets and vegan diets. They all seem to have a positive effect on visceral fat. And this is good news. And this bit is really important because when you're in your 50s and beyond, you need something that's going to be sustainable. You need a plan and a way of eating that's going to last you 30 years, not 30 days. So you've got to pick something you can stick to. And from my experience with clients, where they sometimes struggle in the long term is where a diet is overly restrictive or involves cutting out an entire food group like carbohydrates. Now, if you can stick to a keto diet in the long term and it works for you, well, that's great. But you don't have to cut out carbohydrates completely, and the evidence backs that up. What's important is the quality of the carbohydrate. Now, one of my biggest bugbears on social media is influencers saying that their way of eating is the only way of eating and everybody should do it. And this is just not true. Different things work for different people, so do what works for you. Now, what works for me, and in my opinion, one of the easiest ways to eat is the Mediterranean diet. And it also happens to be one of the most studied. And the Mediterranean diet is associated with a reduction in cardiovascular events like heart attacks or strokes. And there's also some pretty solid evidence that the Mediterranean diet reduces visceral fat. Now, the direct trial showed that when it came to weight loss, the Mediterranean diet performed as well as a low-carb diet or a low-fat diet at the 2-year point. Now, in the direct plus trial, participants were randomly split into 3 groups. The first group ate a traditional healthy diet based on national guidance. The second group ate a Mediterranean diet, and the third group ate a modified Mediterranean diet, the so-called Green Med diet. And this involved supplementing the diet with polyphenols. I'll come on to those in a minute. And each group was given free membership of a gym and encouraged to use it. Now, both of the Mediterranean diets included 28 grams of walnuts, and the Green Med diet, in addition, well, they drank 3 to 4 cups of green tea a day and a shake made with duckweed. They also reduced their intake of meat. And I had to Google duckweed, and it literally is the green stuff that grows on top of ponds. Doesn't look particularly appetizing. Other green vegetables are available. And in terms of the results, despite a similar amount of weight loss across the groups, the Green Med diet group, well, they lost about twice the amount of visceral fat as the regular Mediterranean group, so 14% compared to 6%. Now, a critique of this study was that it was predominantly carried out on men, with across the 3 groups between 81 and 86%. And this is because it was carried out in a specific workplace that just happened to be male dominated. And this was because people ate their main meal there at lunchtime, so the researchers could keep a careful eye on what they were eating. And this trial was supported financially by the Californian Walnut Commission. So yes, you could argue it's been sponsored by Big Nut. But for me, the science does stack up, because the Mediterranean diet group, well, they ate walnuts as well, and they didn't have such a big reduction in visceral fat as the group having the polyphenols. And there is some separate evidence out there that adding polyphenols to the diet reduces waist circumference in postmenopausal women as well. Now, in terms of the overall health benefits from the Mediterranean diet, those are thought to stem from the inclusion of whole grains, beans and legumes, olive oil, fish, lots of fruit and vegetables, and yes, some nuts. And the reduced intake of saturated fat and increased intake of fibre, well, that's associated with improvements in insulin resistance and a reduction in the risk factors for heart disease. So what, I hear you cry, are polyphenols? Well, these are compounds found in plants that have health benefits in humans. And they tend to be more abundant in the deeply coloured fruit and vegetables. For example, blueberries contain something called anthocyanins. Those are a subclass of polyphenol called a flavonoid, and they're responsible for giving fruit and flowers in that group the dark blue colour. And this is where we can get really smart when it comes to tackling visceral fat, by adding these polyphenol containing foods into our diet. So try to eat some of the following foods every day. Dark coloured berries, tea, both green and black count, nuts with the skin on, for example, almonds, pecans, walnuts and hazelnuts. Extra virgin olive oil, but just watch for quantities because oil and nuts are calorie dense. Cocoa, ground flaxseed, red onions, dark green veg like spinach and soy. Now, the polyphenols in soy are the so-called isoflavones. They're what's called a phytoestrogen, so a plant substance that's like estrogen. And there is some evidence that they can be associated with a reduction in menopause symptoms. So to summarise, how to eat. Aim for unprocessed whole foods. Keep added sugars low, particularly sugary drinks like soda, fruit juices and sweetened coffee. avoid refined carbohydrates and choose whole grains, and eat a wide variety of deeply coloured fruit and veg, and try adding some more of those polyphenol containing foods. And improving diet quality will sometimes improve diet quantity on its own, because those processed foods tend to be quite calorie dense because they're high in sugar and fat. And if you're watching this and thinking, yeah, okay, I get the evidence, but I need some help putting it into place, well, keep watching, because at the end I'll explain how I can support you. So moving on to exercise, and when we look at how much of our daily energy expenditure is due to exercise, it's only a small amount, so around 5%, which is why for weight loss, diet beats exercise. However, exercise appears to be particularly good at reducing visceral fat. And in this study, both diet and exercise reduced visceral fat, but there was a trend. It didn't quite reach significance, but not far off, showing that exercise had the bigger effect. Now, I hope we all know that for women over 50, strength work is really important to maintain our muscle mass as we age, and I do talk about that quite frequently on this channel. But when it comes to reducing visceral fat, aerobic exercise is king. Or queen. Now, I've seen an awful lot of misinformation online about exercise in older women, specifically around cortisol, saying that certain types of exercise in the women over 50 spike cortisol and lead us to accumulate belly fat. And in my opinion, this is nonsense. Yes, cortisol can spike. It spikes in relation to aerobic as well as resistance exercise. It's supposed to. Your cortisol levels do fluctuate through the day. That's normal. What's important is the recovery, i.e. going back down to baseline. And there is no evidence, certainly that I have found, that these transient spikes lead to an increase in belly fat. Now, chronic stress where you don't get recovery, of course, that's another matter altogether, and that is associated with obesity. There are already enough barriers out there to women, particularly midlife women, exercising. And we don't need to create yet more by worrying about little fluctuations in cortisol following a hike or a bike ride when the data says that it's not a problem. And what the data does say is that aerobic exercise actually reduces visceral fat. Now, this meta-analysis, remember, that's a study that pools lots of other studies for the results, so it's really strong evidence. It showed that aerobic exercise and resistance exercise both reduced visceral fat, but the effect of the aerobic exercise was greater. Aerobic exercise can reduce visceral fat even if there isn't weight loss. And the effect is dose dependent, so the more you do, the bigger the benefit, but the benefits do start at only a small amount. And the type doesn't matter, so moderate ongoing aerobic exercise and HIIT, so high intensity interval training, well, they're equally effective. As with diet, the best form of exercise is the one you enjoy and the one you're going to stick with. And yes, there is evidence that aerobic exercise decreases body fat in postmenopausal women too. So to sum up exercise, aerobic movement is a really powerful tool for battling deep belly fat, and it might be more effective than diet. And if you're currently sedentary and you want to start doing some aerobic exercise, start small. Try walking. If you're walking fast enough to put your heart rate up a little bit and feel slightly out of breath, then it counts. And while resistance training isn't quite as good for reducing visceral fat, it has a myriad of other benefits in older women, so balance your movement as well as your diet. And finally, because I focus on whole well-being, there's a couple of other things you can do that will influence your visceral fat levels. First, sleep, because sleep deprivation is associated with increased levels of visceral fat. So aim for 7 to 9 hours a night. And in addition, sleep deprivation is associated with cravings for high sugar and high fat foods. And secondly, stress. As I discussed earlier, chronic stress, well, that's associated with increased cortisol pathways and obesity. So learning to manage stress in the long term is critical for healthy aging. Easier said than done, I know, so I'll link some videos on stress and sleep in the description box below. And if this video has prompted you to make some changes and you'd like a bit of support putting science into action, you might want to think about joining the January cohort of my group coaching program. It's called Reignite with Ruth. and it's got 4 components. Firstly, educational content on nutrition, exercise, sleep, stress, and mindful eating techniques to help with portion sizes and cravings. Secondly, tools to build habits and shift mindset so you can bounce back when life gets tough. Thirdly, a weekly 90-minute live coaching call for support and goal setting. And finally, community via WhatsApp with daily encouragement, motivation, and access to me. It's a 10-week programme and I've reduced it to just £347 because I'm piloting some video content. And here's what some previous participants had to say. It's a highly effective formula for re-envisioning what good health looks like. Superb resources for graceful, healthy ageing, and the group feels like a safe space, no judgment, just encouragement. I'll put the link to apply on screen and in the description box below. So there we have it. In conclusion, to reduce visceral fat, do the following. Number 1, improve diet quality. The pattern matters less than focusing on whole foods, plants, and polyphenols. The Mediterranean diet is a good place to start. Number 2, do aerobic exercise, any kind as long as you enjoy it. Add strength work for overall healthy ageing. Start small if needed, a brisk walk counts. And thirdly, prioritise 7 to 9 hours of sleep and work on managing long-term stress. I'll leave part 1 of the video on visceral fat here in case you missed it, and thank you for watching.